The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner buzzed overhead as Robert Bob Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass door, his weathered hands trembling as he clutched a small, waterlogged baby blanket against his chest. At 62, Bob had the kind of face that spoke of decades spent working outdoors, sun-weathered skin, deep lines around grey eyes that had seen too much, and calloused hands that told stories of construction sites and long days under unforgiving skies. The storm outside had been relentless, turning the streets of Cedar Falls, Ohio, into rushing rivers. Bob's work boots squelched against the checkered linoleum floor, leaving muddy prints that traced his path to the corner booth he'd claimed as his own for the past 3 months. Every eye in the diner followed him, the waitresses whispering behind the counter, the truckers pausing mid-bite, the elderly couple by the window exchanging concerned glances. Nobody asked why he was soaked to the bone at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Nobody asked about the blanket. "Coffee, Bob?" Marlene, the head waitress, approached with practiced caution. She'd been serving him since he started coming in, had watched him shrink into himself with each passing week. Her voice carried the gentle tone reserved for broken things. Bob nodded without looking up, his attention fixed on the blanket in his lap. The pale yellow fabric, once decorated with tiny ducks, was now stained with stormwater and something darker, the weight of memories that refused to wash clean. "Rough day out there," Marlene continued, setting down the steaming mug. The coffee was black, just how he always ordered it. "That storm came out of nowhere." "Storms always do," Bob muttered, his voice barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. His fingers traced the edge of the blanket, following a familiar pattern worn smooth by countless repetitions of the same unconscious gesture. Through the rain-streaked window, Cedar Falls looked like a town underwater. The small industrial city had seen better days. Empty storefronts lined Main Street, and the old factory that once employed half the town sat silent, its windows boarded up like closed eyes. Bob had helped build that factory 40 years ago, back when his hands were steady and his future seemed as solid as the steel beams he'd helped raise. The diner's bell chimed as another customer entered, shaking rain from his umbrella. Bob instinctively pulled the blanket closer, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Marlene. She'd seen trauma before. This was a town where men learned to swallow their pain along with their pride, where asking for help was seen as weakness. "You know," Marlene said quietly, refilling his coffee though he'd barely touched it, "my grandmother used to say that storms wash away what needs washing, but they also water what needs growing." Bob's grey eyes flicked up to meet hers for just a moment, long enough for her to see the depths of his pain, the kind that doesn't heal with time, but instead settles into your bones like winter cold. "Some things shouldn't grow," he said, returning his gaze to the window where lightning illuminated the deserted street in stark, momentary clarity. As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified. Other customers came and went, shooting curious glances at the man in the corner booth who hadn't moved in 2 hours, who held that waterlogged blanket like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this world. The coffee in his mug grew cold, then colder, forming a thin skin that reflected the fluorescent lights like a dark mirror. Bob's mind drifted to 3 months ago, to the phone call that had shattered his world into before and after. The voice on the other end had been professional, clinical, a social worker delivering news that no grandparent should ever hear. He'd driven through the night to get to Portland, his pickup truck eating up the miles between Ohio and Oregon, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. But he'd been too late. Always too late. The blanket had been the only thing left, the only piece of 6-month-old Emma that he could hold. His daughter Sarah's addiction had finally claimed its ultimate victim, not just herself, but the innocent child who depended on her. The authorities had been kind but firm. Emma would be placed with a family better equipped to handle an infant. Bob, a single grandfather struggling with his own demons since his wife's death 2 years prior, didn't meet their criteria for stability. "Sir," a young voice broke through his reverie. Bob looked up to find a teenager, maybe 17, with earnest brown eyes and the kind of fresh-faced hope that hadn't yet been weathered by life's storms. The boy wore a Cedar Falls high school varsity jacket, soggy from the rain. "My car broke down out there," the teenager continued, gesturing toward the parking lot. "I was wondering if you might know anything about engines. I saw your pickup. Looks like you might know your way around mechanical stuff." Bob studied the boy's face. There was something familiar about him, though he couldn't place it. The kid had that nervous energy of someone asking for help, but trying not to seem desperate about it. "What's wrong with it?" Bob heard himself ask, his voice rusty from disuse. "It just died on me, right in the middle of 3rd Street. I managed to push it into the lot here, but—" The boy shrugged, a gesture that reminded Bob painfully of his own son at that age, before the drinking, before the accident that had left Bob a widower and his daughter Sarah an orphan at 16. Bob looked down at the blanket in his hands, then back at the boy. For the first time in months, someone was asking him for something other than pity or professional help. Someone needed what he could offer. "I'll take a look," he said quietly, carefully folding the blanket and placing it in his jacket pocket. "But we'll have to wait for the storm to ease up." The teenager's face broke into a relieved smile. "Thank you, sir. I'm Marcus, by the way, Marcus Williams." "Bob Mitchell." He extended a weathered hand, and Marcus shook it with the firm grip his father had probably taught him. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" Marcus shook his head, sliding into the booth across from Bob with the easy confidence of youth. "Just moved here with my mom last month. She got a job at the community center, helping families with difficult situations." Bob felt something twist in his chest. "What kind of difficult situations?" "Addiction recovery, mostly. Family reunification services. She says everyone deserves a second chance, even when the first chance went really wrong." Marcus paused, studying Bob's face with the intuition that sometimes came with growing up in chaos. "She's helped a lot of people put their lives back together." Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The thunder rolled farther away, and the rain against the windows softened from a harsh drumming to a gentler patter. Bob found himself looking at this young man, Marcus Williams, and wondering what twist of fate had brought them together in this moment, in this place. "Tell me about your mother's work," Bob said quietly, his hand unconsciously moving to the pocket where Emma's blanket rested against his heart. As Marcus began to speak about second chances and the families his mother had helped reunite, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 months, the faintest flicker of something that might, eventually, become hope. The storm was passing, but its work was just beginning. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time Bob and Marcus made their way to the parking lot behind Murphy's Diner. Marcus's car, a battered 1995 Honda Civic with more rust than paint, sat in a puddle that reflected the grey afternoon sky like a broken mirror. Bob pulled his collar up against the moisture, feeling the weight of Emma's blanket in his pocket with each step. "She's not much to look at," Marcus said apologetically, running a hand through his damp hair. "But she got us here from Phoenix, and that's more than I expected." Bob circled the vehicle, his practiced eye taking in the details that spoke to a car's history. The odometer probably read close to 200,000 miles. The driver's side mirror was held on with duct tape, and the rear bumper bore a collection of stickers from various states, evidence of a life lived in motion. "Phoenix to here is a long haul," Bob observed, popping the hood. What brought you and your mom to Cedar Falls? Marcus leaned against the fender, watching as Bob examined the engine with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent decades diagnosing problems. Mom got tired of running, I guess. She said it was time to stop moving and start helping people the way she'd been helped. The engine bay told its own story: jury-rigged repairs, aftermarket parts, and the kind of creative problem-solving that came from keeping a car alive on a shoestring budget. Bob traced a finger along the battery cables, checking connections with the automatic precision of muscle memory. "Your alternator belt's loose," he said, pointing to the frayed rubber. "And this battery connection's seen better days. You got any tools in the trunk?" "Just a basic toolkit my mom bought at a gas station somewhere in New Mexico." Marcus disappeared around the back of the car, returning with a small metal box that had seen as many miles as the vehicle itself. As Bob worked, his movements careful and deliberate despite his trembling hands, Marcus found himself studying the older man's face. There was something about Bob that reminded him of the men he'd grown up around, not his biological father, who'd disappeared before Marcus could form memories, but the string of his mother's boyfriends who'd drifted in and out of their lives like weather patterns. Most had been broken in their own ways, carrying invisible wounds that leaked out in anger or alcohol, or the kind of silence that filled rooms like smoke. But Bob was different. His brokenness was quieter, more contained, like a deep well that reflected only sky while hiding its true depth. "There," Bob said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "Try her now." Marcus slid behind the wheel, and the engine turned over on the second try, settling into the familiar, rough idle that had carried them across half the country. Through the windshield, he could see Bob nodding with satisfaction, already closing the hood. "That should get you home," Bob said when Marcus climbed out, "but you'll want to replace that belt soon, and the battery's not going to last much longer." "How much do I owe you?" Marcus reached for his wallet, though both of them could see it contained more receipts than bills. Bob waved him off. "Consider it a welcome to Cedar Falls." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "You said your mother helps families with addiction issues." "Yeah. She runs group sessions, helps with court-mandated counseling, works with Child Protective Services on reunification cases." Marcus studied Bob's weathered face. "Did you lose someone to addiction?" The question hung between them in the drizzling air. Bob's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, fingers finding the damp fabric of Emma's blanket. "My daughter," he said finally. "Sarah. She overdosed 3 months ago. Left behind a baby girl." Marcus felt the familiar weight of recognition, the kind that came from growing up in the orbit of addiction, where everyone's story shared the same gravitational pull toward loss. "I'm sorry. I know how that feels." Bob looked up sharply. "Your mother?" "Clean for 4 years now," Marcus said quickly, "but it was touch and go for a while. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, went through the system briefly when things got really bad." He leaned against the car, rain droplets catching in his dark hair. "The baby, where is she now?" "Foster care, in Portland." Bob's voice was barely audible above the sound of rain on metal. "They said I wasn't suitable. Too old, too unstable, living on disability since my construction accident 2 years ago." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Marcus could hear the pain underneath, the kind of hurt that had settled so deep it had become part of the person's foundation. What was her name? The baby. Emma Rose Mitchell. Bob pulled the blanket from his pocket, unfolding it slightly so Marcus could see the faded yellow fabric, the tiny duck pattern barely visible through the stains. "This was hers, only thing they let me keep." Marcus stared at the blanket, and something clicked into place. A conversation he'd overheard between his mother and her supervisor at the community center, something about a case file that had been transferred from Oregon, a grandfather who'd been denied custody but was appealing the decision. "Bob?" he said slowly. "What's your last name?" "Mitchell. Robert Mitchell." Bob looked puzzled by the question. "Why?" Marcus felt his heart begin to race. "I think my mum might know about your case. She mentioned a Robert Mitchell yesterday, said it was heartbreaking, that the grandfather seemed like he genuinely wanted to raise his granddaughter, but the system was working against him." Bob went very still. "What do you mean, working against me?" "She said the initial assessment was rushed, that the social worker who handled it was overwhelmed and made recommendations based on surface factors rather than actual capability." Though Marcus could see hope flickering in Bob's grey eyes, fragile as candlelight in wind. "She's been trying to figure out how to help, but she didn't know how to reach you." The rain had stopped completely now, though neither man noticed. They stood in the parking lot behind a small-town diner while the world rearranged itself around them, connections forming that neither had expected when they'd woken up that morning. "Could I meet her?" Bob's voice was rough with emotion. "Your mother? She's working tonight, but she'll be home around 9. We live in the green duplex on Elm Street, just past the old Presbyterian church." Marcus pulled out his phone. "Here, let me give you our address." As they exchanged information, Bob felt something loosening in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the absence of the crushing certainty that had defined his last 3 months. Maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. "Marcus," he said as the young man prepared to leave, "why did you come into the diner? I mean, really, there's a gas station right across the street with a payphone." Marcus considered the question, his hand on the car door. "Honestly, you looked like someone who needed to help somebody, and I needed help. Sometimes things just work out that way." Bob watched the Honda disappear down Main Street, its taillights reflecting off the wet asphalt like red stars fallen to earth. In his pocket, Emma's blanket felt different somehow, less like a memorial and more like a bridge to something that might still be possible. For the first time in 3 months, Bob Mitchell allowed himself to believe that storms might indeed wash away what needed washing, while watering what needed to grow. The green duplex on Elm Street looked exactly like the kind of place where hope went to rehabilitate itself. Bob sat in his pickup truck outside the modest home, engine ticking as it cooled, watching warm light spill from the windows into the October darkness. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind air that smelled of wet leaves and the promise of winter. But his hands still trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Through the front window, he could see Marcus moving around what appeared to be a kitchen, and beside him, a woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even from this distance, Bob could see the efficiency in her movements, the kind of purposeful energy that came from years of managing crisis situations. Emma's blanket lay folded on the passenger seat beside him, and he found himself reaching for it before stepping out of the truck. The fabric had dried during the drive, but it still carried the faint scent of stormwater and memory. The woman who answered the door was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 55, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of face that suggested she'd learned to see past surface appearances to the truth underneath. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Diana Williams. Marcus told me about your situation." She stepped aside, gesturing him into a living room that was clearly designed for functionality over style. Comfortable furniture arranged to facilitate conversation, shelves lined with professional journals and family photos, a desk in the corner covered with case files. "Please, call me Bob." He settled into the offered chair, noting how Diana positioned herself across from him, close enough to establish trust, far enough to maintain professional boundaries. "Marcus said you might know something about my granddaughter's case." Diana poured coffee from a thermal carafe, her movements deliberate and calming. "I received Emma's file last week as part of a review process. The Oregon office is overwhelmed, and several cases have been transferred to offices with more resources for thorough assessment. Bob felt his chest tighten. What kind of assessment? The kind that looks at the whole picture, not just the surface factors. Diana opened a folder on the coffee table between them. Your initial evaluation was conducted during a crisis period. You'd just lost your daughter, you were dealing with your own grief and trauma, and the system was focused on immediate placement rather than long-term stability. She pulled out a document, but kept it face down on the table. Tell me about your life before Sarah's death. What was your routine like? How did you manage after your wife passed? Bob found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed with anyone, his work as a construction foreman before the accident that had damaged his back and left him on disability, the quiet rhythm of his days after Margaret's death, the small apartment he'd maintained with military precision, the grief counseling sessions he'd attended faithfully for 18 months. I wasn't falling apart, he said finally. I was doing the work, going to therapy, managing my pain medication responsibly, keeping my living space clean. I had systems in place. Diana nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. The social worker who conducted your initial assessment noted concerns about your age, your disability status, and your housing situation, but she spent less than an hour with you, didn't visit your home, and didn't interview any references. That's not a comprehensive evaluation. Marcus appeared in the doorway holding a steaming mug. Mind if I sit in? I know this is personal, but... He glanced at his mother, who nodded permission. Marcus told me about finding you at the diner today, Diana continued. About the blanket you were carrying. That kind of attachment object isn't unusual in grief, but it also suggests something important about your connection to Emma. Bob's fingers tightened on the blanket in his lap. She's all I have left of Sarah, of my family. What do you remember about Sarah before her addiction took hold? The question caught him off guard. Most people wanted to know about the addiction itself, the dramatic collapse, the tragic ending. Diana was asking about the person underneath the disease. She was bright, curious about everything, used to take apart my tools when she was little, just to see how they worked. Bob's voice grew stronger as he spoke. After her mother died, she got scared. Started using to numb the fear, but the smart, caring person was still there underneath. Even at the end, when she called to tell me about Emma, she was trying to do right by that baby. Diana leaned forward slightly. What did she say about Emma? That she was beautiful, that she had my eyes, Sarah's eyes, that she deserved better than what Sarah could give her at the time. Bob's voice cracked. Sarah was going to get clean. She had a plan. But the drugs were stronger than her good intentions. They often are, Diana said quietly, but that doesn't mean Sarah didn't love Emma or that she didn't want what was best for her daughter. From across the room, Marcus watched this careful excavation of a man's broken heart. His own experience had taught him to recognize the difference between someone who was genuinely trying to heal and someone who was simply performing recovery for an audience. Bob Mitchell was doing the hard work of grief, even when no one was watching. Here's what I can tell you, Diana said, finally turning over the document on the table. Emma's current placement isn't permanent. The foster family is loving but temporary. They specialize in crisis care for infants, not long-term adoption. The state is actively seeking a permanent solution. Bob's hands went still on the blanket. What does that mean? It means there's still a window for family placement, if the family member can demonstrate stability and capability. Diana met his eyes directly. I'd like to recommend you for a full re-evaluation. Home visit, character references, assessment of your support systems, review of your financial situation. I don't have much money, Bob said quickly. The disability doesn't go far, and I've been spending everything I have on lawyers and travel to Portland. The state isn't looking for wealth. They're looking for stability, consistency, and genuine commitment to the child's welfare. Diana pulled out another form. What I see in your file is a man who maintained steady employment for 40 years, who sought help when he needed it, who's been managing his own challenges responsibly. The question is whether you can provide a safe, loving environment for a growing child. Marcus leaned forward. He fixed my car today in the rain, just because I asked. Didn't want payment, didn't make it about him. That tells you something about character. Diana smiled at her son. Yes, it does. She turned back to Bob. I have to ask some difficult questions. Are you prepared to raise a child from infancy to adulthood? Do you have energy for 2 a.m. feedings, for teaching a toddler to walk, for helping with homework and driving to soccer practice? Bob was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the romantic notion of raising his granddaughter, but the daily reality of it. I'm 62, not 92. My back's damaged, but my heart works fine. I've got maybe 20 good years left, and I can't think of a better way to spend them than giving Emma the childhood her mother never got to finish. The room fell silent, except for the soft tick of a mantel clock. Diana studied Bob's face, and he found himself meeting her gaze steadily. This wasn't about convincing anyone of anything false. It was about revealing the truth of who he was beneath the grief and bureaucratic obstacles. All right, Diana said finally. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow, start the re-evaluation process. It won't be quick and it won't be easy, but if you're willing to do the work, I think there's a real chance of bringing Emma home. Bob felt something break open in his chest. Not the sharp crack of more damage, but the slow, careful opening of something that had been closed too long. What do I need to do? Diana handed him a list she'd been preparing. Home inspection prep, character references, financial documentation, completion of parenting classes, and a psychological evaluation to address the grief and trauma factors. It's a lot, but it's all doable. As Bob prepared to leave, Marcus walked him to the door. My mom's good at this, he said quietly. She brought me back from some pretty dark places. If anyone can help you get Emma back, it's her. Bob shook the young man's hand, remembering the desperate teenager who'd approached him in the diner just 8 hours earlier. Thank you for breaking down, for asking for help, for bringing me here. I don't think it was an accident. Marcus grinned. My mom says there's no such thing as coincidence, just people finding each other when they need to. Driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Bob felt Emma's blanket on the seat beside him, but for the first time in 3 months, it didn't feel like a memorial. It felt like a promise, one he might actually be able to keep. The work was just beginning, but at least now he knew what the work was. 6 weeks later, Bob Mitchell stood in his apartment at 5:30 in the morning, adjusting his tie in the bathroom mirror and trying to quiet the storm of nerves in his stomach. Today was the final hearing, the moment when a judge would decide whether Emma Rose Mitchell would come home to Cedar Falls or remain in the foster care system permanently. The apartment looked different now. Gone were the piles of unopened mail and the dishes that had sat unwashed for days during his darkest period. In their place was the careful order of a man preparing to raise a child. A crib, assembled in the corner of his bedroom, bottles sterilizing on the kitchen counter, safety latches installed on every cabinet. The walls bore new additions, framed photos of Sarah as a child, alongside pictures of Emma that Diana had helped him obtain from the foster family. Marcus Williams appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in his best button-down shirt, holding 2 travel mugs of coffee. At 17, he'd become an unlikely pillar of support during the evaluation process, helping Bob navigate everything from parenting classes to the emotional maze of home inspections. Mum's already in the car, Marcus said, handing Bob the coffee. She said to tell you that Judge Patterson is fair but thorough. She'll listen to what everyone has to say before making her decision. Bob nodded, his throat too tight for words. Over the past 6 weeks, Diana Williams had become more than a social worker. She'd become the architect of possibility, methodically building a case that demonstrated not just Bob's capability, but his genuine transformation in the face of grief. The psychological evaluation had been grueling, but necessary, forcing him to articulate not just his pain, but his path through it. The drive to Portland took 2 hours, during which Diana reviewed the case file one final time. The foster family, the Hendersons, would be present to report on Emma's development and their recommendations. The state-appointed guardian would present the official recommendation, and Bob would have his chance to speak directly to the judge about his readiness to become Emma's guardian. "Remember," Diana said as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, "this isn't about proving you're perfect. It's about demonstrating that you're committed, prepared, and capable of providing the stability Emma needs." The courtroom was smaller than Bob had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark relief. Emma's foster mother, Janet Henderson, sat in the front row holding a 6-month-old baby who had grown dramatically since Bob had last seen her. Emma's hair had darkened to brown, Sarah's color, but her eyes were indeed Bob's grey-blue, alert and curious as she looked around the unfamiliar room. Bob's chest constricted at the sight of his granddaughter. She was real, solid, present, no longer just the abstract concept he'd been fighting for, but a living child who would need breakfast every morning and bedtime stories every night. Judge Patricia Patterson was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested she'd seen every variation of human complexity that could appear in a courtroom. She reviewed the documents before her with careful attention before looking up at the assembled parties. "This case concerns the permanent placement of Emma Rose Mitchell, currently 6 months old," she began. "The court has received comprehensive evaluations from multiple sources, and I've reviewed all submitted documentation. Mrs. Henderson, please report on Emma's current status." Janet Henderson stood, her voice clear and professional. "Emma is a healthy, developing child. She's meeting all her milestones, sleeping through the night, and demonstrating normal social engagement. She's been in our care for 3 months and has adapted well to routine and structure." The judge nodded. "And your recommendation regarding permanent placement?" "Your Honor, while we've grown attached to Emma and would be willing to adopt her if necessary, we believe family placement is preferable when safe and appropriate. Mr. Mitchell's transformation over the past 6 weeks has been remarkable. He's demonstrated genuine commitment to Emma's welfare and has made substantial improvements to his living situation and emotional stability." Bob felt tears sting his eyes at this unexpected support from the woman who could have easily recommended that Emma remain with her current family. The state guardian presented next, reviewing the technical aspects of Bob's evaluation, his completion of parenting classes, the home inspection results, his financial stability, and the psychological assessment that had concluded he was grieving appropriately while maintaining realistic expectations about child-rearing responsibilities. Then it was Bob's turn. He stood slowly, his prepared speech forgotten, as he looked at Emma in Janet Henderson's arms. The baby was watching him with that intense focus that infants sometimes display, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "3 months ago, I was a broken man carrying my granddaughter's blanket because it was the only piece of her I had left. I was angry at the system, angry at my daughter's addiction, angry at God for taking away everyone I loved." He paused, looking directly at Judge Patterson. "But Emma deserves better than my anger. She deserves someone who's done the work to heal, who can give her not just a roof over her head, but a real home where she can grow up, knowing she's loved and wanted. Bob reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Emma's blanket, clean now, carefully mended where the fabric had worn thin. This blanket was all I had of her for 3 months, but I don't want it to be a memorial anymore. I want it to be the blanket she sleeps with, the one she carries around when she's learning to walk, the one that connects her to her mother's love, even though Sarah can't be here to give it herself. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Emma had stopped making the small sounds that babies use to explore their world. I know I'm not young. I know raising a child at 62 will be challenging, but I've raised a child before, and even though Sarah's story ended in tragedy, she had good years too. Happy years. I want to give Emma those same chances, plus the wisdom I've gained from loss. Bob's voice grew steadier as he continued. Emma needs to know where she comes from. She needs to hear stories about her mother's curiosity and intelligence, about her grandmother's kindness, about the family that loved her before she was even born. I can give her that continuity, that sense of belonging that goes deeper than good intentions. He looked at Emma again, and this time she smiled, one of those radiant baby smiles that transforms a face into pure joy. Most importantly, Your Honor, Emma has already been abandoned once by circumstances beyond anyone's control. I want her to grow up knowing that someone fought for her, that she was worth the effort, that family means something real and permanent. Judge Patterson was quiet for a long moment after Bob sat down, studying the documents before her with careful attention. The courtroom held its collective breath. Mr. Mitchell, she said finally, the court recognizes that this case involves complex factors: grief, addiction, family trauma, and the challenge of late-in-life parenting. However, the evidence presented demonstrates genuine commitment to rehabilitation and preparation for child-rearing responsibilities. Bob's heart hammered against his ribs. The psychological evaluation indicates that your grief process, while profound, has not impaired your judgment or capability. The home inspection reveals appropriate preparation for infant care, your completion of parenting classes, and your demonstrated support system through Mrs. Williams and her son suggest sustainable resources for ongoing child welfare. Judge Patterson looked directly at Bob. Most importantly, Emma needs permanency and continuity. While the Henderson family has provided excellent care, you represent her biological family and cultural heritage. Given your demonstrated commitment to her welfare and your successful completion of all required assessments, the court awards you full legal guardianship of Emma Rose Mitchell. The words took a moment to register. Then Bob felt his knees give way as he sank back into his chair, tears streaming down his weathered face. Behind him, he could hear Diana's quiet, "Yes," and Marcus's whispered, "We did it." Janet Henderson approached him with Emma in her arms. "She's a wonderful baby," she said softly. "You're going to love being her grandfather." Bob's hands trembled as he reached for Emma, but when she settled into his arms, everything went still. She looked up at him with those grey-blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, his eyes, and made a small sound of contentment. "Hello, Emma Rose," he whispered. "I'm your grandpa. I've been waiting to meet you." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Bob carefully wrapped Emma in her yellow blanket with the tiny ducks. Outside, the Oregon sky was overcast but not threatening, the kind of grey that promised rain later but held sunshine in its potential. Marcus held the car door open as Bob secured Emma in her car seat, the baby already drowsing against the familiar softness of her blanket. Diana started the engine, glancing in the rearview mirror at the man who'd walked into Murphy's diner 6 weeks ago, carrying only grief, and emerged from a Portland courthouse carrying his future. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Bob looked down at Emma, then out at the city where Sarah had died, where this long journey had begun. "Yes," he said quietly. We're ready to go home." The drive back to Cedar Falls took them through small towns and farming communities, past landscapes that spoke of persistence and the patient work of growing things in difficult soil. Emma slept most of the way, occasionally making the small sounds that babies use to communicate with their dreams. As they pulled into the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The simple rightness of knowing where he belonged and why. The apartment that had felt like a way station now felt like a beginning. That evening, as Emma took her bottle and Bob learned the rhythm of her breathing, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, helping with thank-you notes to everyone who'd supported the case. "What are you going to tell her about her mother?" Marcus asked quietly. Bob looked down at Emma, who was watching his face with the intense attention that babies give to the most important things in their world. "I'm going to tell her that Sarah loved her enough to make sure she'd be safe, even when Sarah couldn't be safe herself," he said. "I'm going to tell her that addiction is a disease, not a choice, and that her mother fought it as hard as she could. And I'm going to tell her that love doesn't end with death, it just changes shape." Emma's eyes drifted closed, but her small hand remained curled around Bob's finger with the kind of trust that demands everything and offers everything in return. Outside, the first drops of evening rain began to tap against the windows, not the violent storm that had brought Bob and Marcus together, but the gentle kind that waters gardens and settles dust and promises that tomorrow will be different from today. Bob Mitchell had learned to see storms differently now. They weren't just destructive forces that took things away, they were also the weather that brought people together, that washed old wounds clean, that watered the seeds of second chances. As Emma settled deeper into sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful, Bob found himself thinking about the blanket that had carried them both through the storm. It would be washed many more times in the years ahead, would absorb tears of frustration when Emma was teething, would provide comfort during childhood fears, would eventually be relegated to a memory box when she outgrew its protection. But tonight, it was exactly what it needed to be. A bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between the grandfather who'd thought his story was ending and the granddaughter who was just beginning to write hers. Outside, the rain continued, gentle, steady, and full of promise for tomorrow's growth.